There was something wrong with the air. Kael Arden paused mid-step, wrench still in hand, as the lights above flickered for the third time in less than a minute. The corridor stretched out before him, metal grates underfoot, conduit lines humming faintly along the walls, overhead panels half lit with aging bulbs that buzzed like angry insects. This station was supposed to be dead. A communications outpost from before the war, abandoned by everyone except bureaucrats and the occasional tech grunt like him. He was sent here alone. No one expected trouble. No one expected anything. And that was the problem. Kael turned slowly, scanning the corridor behind him. It was still. Too still. He could hear his own breath echoing through his mask. No movement, no sound. But something had changed, not on the surface. In the feel of it, like the air had tensed, like the station was holding its breath. He adjusted the torchlight on his wrist, swept it down the hallway. Nothing, just rust and shadows. He exhaled and turned back toward the access panel. 3 wires left to reconnect, and then he could send the all clear. Get out of here. Go back to a place where light stayed on and walls didn't whisper. His fingers moved fast, working muscle memory, tightening clamps and resetting lines. The station's old bones creaked above him. One last spark, system humming. Done. He stood up and froze. There, at the far end of the hall, something moved, not fast, not loud, just present. A shadow taller than a man, broad-shouldered, head slightly tilted, watching. Kael couldn't see its face, couldn't see its eyes, but he felt it. The same way a deer feels a hunter. His breath caught. The figure stepped forward. No noise, no footsteps. Kael backed up instinctively, reaching for the emergency baton on his belt. Not a weapon, barely a deterrent. But it was something. The lights flickered again. When they came back on, the figure was gone. Kael stood alone. The hallway buzzed. He should call command, send a distress ping. But his hand hesitated over the comm button. What if they didn't believe him? What if it was nothing? He turned back toward the maintenance hatch and stopped. A figure stood behind him, close. Too close. Her skin shimmered like liquid chrome under the torchlight, etched with faint scars that looked more like symbols than wounds. Her eyes were gold, burning, alien, aware. She wore armor he didn't recognize, black and angular, like it was shaped to disappear in shadow. She said nothing. Kael didn't breathe. Her hand moved, fast, too fast. A blade kissed his throat, and yet she didn't press. She just held it there, waiting, watching. Kael met her gaze. "I don't know who sent you," he said quietly, "but I'm not armed." Her expression didn't change. Her voice, when it came, was soft, precise. "You are Kael Arden." It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "Then you are the one I was sent to kill." The blade didn't move. Neither did Kael. His breath came slow and shallow, throat dry where the edge of the weapon hovered, not touching, just waiting. The woman stood close, too close for any reaction that didn't end with blood. Her eyes never left his. They weren't cruel, just impossibly focused, like she was studying more than his face, like she was deciding whether or not he deserved to breathe. Kael spoke first. "I'm guessing talking my way out of this isn't in your training." A beat of silence, then, almost imperceptibly, her brow shifted. "You didn't run," she said. Her voice was quiet, sharp, and carried no accent he recognized. Most targets run. Kael forced a shrug, though his body screamed to stay still. "Not much point. I've seen the way you move. I'd be dead before the third step." Her golden eyes narrowed. "You're calm." "Not calm," Kael corrected. "Just realistic." Another moment passed, then the blade lowered, an inch, maybe 2, still close enough to kill. But something in the air loosened. Kael didn't dare move. She tilted her head. "You're not what I expected." "Let me guess. Taller, more threatening. Secretly packing hidden weapons in my socks? You were supposed to beg." Kael smiled thinly. Not really the begging type. The woman's gaze flicked down, scanning him. Not for weapons, she'd already seen he had none. She was reading posture, heart rate, sweat. She wasn't looking for lies, she was looking for purpose. "I was told you were a threat," she said, "a potential disruptor. Valuable to the rebellion, dangerous if kept alive." Kael blinked. Rebellion. Her grip tightened on the hilt. "You don't know what you are." "I'm an engineer," he said. "I fix broken things, that's it." Her jaw tensed. Everyone says that right before they stop pretending. Kael took a small, slow breath. "If you were ordered to kill me, then why are we still talking?" That question landed harder than he expected. She looked away for the first time, just briefly. And in that moment something shifted. Hesitation, not weakness, conflict. Kael didn't push. He just stayed still, offering no threat. Only a question she clearly didn't want to answer. Then her voice dropped, quieter now. The contract changed. "How?" She looked back at him. "Alive, for questioning. But if you resist, lethal force authorized." "And you think I'm resisting?" "No," she admitted. "That's what bothers me." Kael frowned. "Because I'm not making it fun for you?" "Because it doesn't feel right." For the first time, she took a step back, not retreating, creating space. She sheathed the blade in one fluid motion, the weapon folding into itself along her wrist in a silent shimmer. "You will stay here," she said, "until I decide what comes next." Kael raised an eyebrow. "So I'm not a prisoner? You're not free either." She turned away, scanning the room. Every angle, every vent, calculating every path of escape Kael never even considered. He sat slowly on the edge of a maintenance console, exhaling. "Do I at least get a name?" he asked. She didn't look at him, but her answer came, flat and final. "Saryth." Kael nodded once. "Saryth, all right." Another pause. Then she added, almost reluctantly, "I'm still deciding whether I regret saying that." Kael offered a tired smile. "You and me both." The silence that followed wasn't sharp, it wasn't tense, it was strange. Kael had expected threats, orders, maybe even restraints. But instead, Saryth sat cross-legged near the far wall of the cramped control room, sharpening a small blade against a piece of metal she'd salvaged from a panel. Not for show, not for intimidation, just habit. Kael moved carefully, setting down a heat pack and unsealing a storage drawer. The emergency rations weren't impressive. Sealed protein bars, mineral gel packs, a few bricks of synthetic starch, but they were edible and, more importantly, neutral. He set 2 on the ground between them. "Peace offering," he said, not entirely joking. Saryth didn't move, didn't look up. "Poisoned?" "Only if you're allergic to bland." She hesitated, then reached forward and took one. Their fingers didn't touch, but the air between them shifted again. This time, less like a standoff, more like a beginning neither of them knew how to name. They ate in silence. Kael chewed slowly, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't eat like a soldier. She ate like someone who didn't know when the next meal would come. Quick, efficient, but not panicked. He recognized it. He'd been there, after the war, after the loss. "You don't have to stay on the floor," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were unreadable. "I don't trust chairs." Kael snorted. "Fair." He leaned back against the wall, staring at the exposed circuitry overhead. You've done this before. Many times. Stalking targets in backwater stations. Number sitting in small rooms with people who should be dead. Kael raised an eyebrow. Am I still on that list? She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He nodded slowly. You know, I keep wondering if I should be afraid. You should, but I'm not, she blinked. Because I don't think you came here to kill me, he said. Saryth stared at him, then set her blade down. Do you always talk this much? Only when I think the silence might get me stabbed. Her lips twitched, barely. A shadow of something that might have been a smirk in another life. Kael reached into his jacket, pulled out a data crystal, and rolled it across the floor. It stopped in front of her. What's this? The last full record of this station's logs before the blackout, before they reassigned it as derelict, before you showed up. She didn't touch it. I thought you didn't care why I was here. I don't, Kael said. But maybe you do. Saryth stared at the crystal for a long time, then picked it up. Her fingers lingered on the surface. The light flickered in her golden eyes. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, she murmured. You weren't supposed to talk to me either, I bet. She looked at him again. This time, longer. Kael didn't look away. He didn't push. He just sat there, breathing, letting the quiet unfold between them like a fragile bridge neither of them wanted to burn. And for the first time, Saryth didn't seem ready to destroy everything in the room. Instead, she leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes, not asleep, not unguarded, but willing. To rest, to stay, to not kill. At least for tonight. The sound of sparking metal filled the room, steady, soft, like rain tapping on a roof made of broken promises. Kael sat cross-legged on the floor, a soldering tool in one hand, a fractured piece of alien armor in the other. The chest plate was unlike any material he'd worked with. Dark gray with a deep pearlescent sheen, and etched with geometric patterns that shimmered when touched. It had taken a direct hit, probably from a plasma lance, and cracked clean through the left side. Saryth sat nearby, shirt off, bandaged shoulder exposed. She said nothing, eyes focused on the wall, but her breath came slower now, less guarded. Kael didn't speak for a long time. He knew better. Some silences weren't empty, they were loaded. Stories wrapped in tension, waiting to see if anyone would be foolish or kind enough to ask. Finally, as he sealed the final fracture, Kael set the plate down and asked quietly, "Why do you keep it?" Saryth glanced at him surprised. "The armor? Even broken, even after it failed you." She was quiet. Then, "It's the only thing I was ever allowed to keep." Kael looked at her. "From where?" Saryth turned away. Her eyes didn't drift. They fled. "I was taken when I was 6, she said. "Black Corps doesn't raise children. They train weapons. I was the third in my cycle to survive long-term field combat." Kael said nothing. She went on. "They keep your DNA in stasis, threaten to erase your bloodline if you disobey. No escape, just missions, one after another." Kael's fingers tightened around the soldering tool. "And now? They found something better," she whispered. "You!" He blinked. "Me? They don't need broken things like me anymore. They want new keys, living ones." Kael frowned. "Keys to what?" Saryth's golden eyes met his. "To gates that were sealed long before humans ever left Earth." A chill crawled up his spine. "Then why didn't you hand me over?" She didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she reached out and touched the newly repaired armor. Her fingers brushed the surface like it was a relic of someone she no longer recognized. "Because you asked if I was tired," she said. "And no one ever asks that." Kyle's breath caught. He remembered that moment. Back in the hallway, when he stood unarmed, when he saw the weight in her stance. He had asked, "Are you tired?" And she had flinched, not in pain, but in recognition. Kael set the tool down, stood, and walked over to her. She didn't move, didn't stop him. He sat beside her, close, their shoulders not quite touching. He looked at her profile, strong, scarred, half lit by the station's failing lights. "I don't know how to fix you," he said, "but I can hold the pieces while you try." Saryth exhaled, long, shaky, her eyes closed, and when she opened them again they were still gold, still sharp, but softer now. "You talk too much," she whispered. "Someone has to." She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. And in that space between their silence, something else lived. Not a truce, not yet trust, but a beginning. The warning came not as a sound, but as a feeling. A prickling beneath the skin, a sudden stillness in the air. Kael paused mid-step, his hand frozen over a maintenance panel. The hairs on his arms lifted. Something was wrong. Saryth moved first. She crossed the room in 2 strides, slammed a hand against the wall and pulled up the internal scan feed. It flickered, distorted, then locked onto a signature. Multiple heat sources moving fast, too fast. "Black core," she said coldly. Kyle's stomach dropped. How did they find us? They always find what they paid to own. She grabbed her armor, still warm from Kyle's earlier repairs, and began snapping it into place with mechanical efficiency. Each piece clicked into her body like it belonged. The quiet of the past few days shattered in an instant. Kael backed toward the tool rack. "How many?" "Too many," she replied. "They sent a purge squad." Kael's fingers found a plasma cutter. Hardly a weapon, but better than nothing. "What do we do?" Saryth locked eyes with him. "We fight." The station trembled as the enemy breached the outer hall. The sound of forced entry echoed through the corridor like a thunderclap wrapped in metal. Saryth stepped in front of Kael instinctively. He stepped beside her. They waited. Footsteps. Then fire. The corridor lit up with muzzle flashes as Black Corps soldiers flooded through, faceless, armored, and ruthless. But Saryth was faster. She dropped 2 with clean shots from her stolen sidearm, danced beneath a third's rifle arc, and plunged a blade into the soft gap of his neck seal. Kael ducked behind the bulkhead, firing bursts with the plasma cutter. It wasn't meant for combat, but he knew the wiring better than anyone. One sweep through a floor vent shorted half the lights in the hallway, and 3 enemies with it. Saryth spun, hair flying as she ducked a blow and kicked her attacker into a power junction. Sparks flew. Smoke filled the hall. Screams dissolved into static. Kael stumbled, coughing, pulling her toward a side shaft. "In here!" She followed without question. They slammed the hatch shut behind them. Silence returned, but it was heavier now. They were bleeding. Saryth had a cut along her jaw, Kael a burn on his forearm. They leaned against opposite walls, breath ragged, hearts racing. Then she looked at him. "Why didn't you run?" she asked. Kael wiped his hand on his shirt, met her eyes. "Because you didn't?" For the first time, her expression cracked. The woman who had arrived with the blade to his throat, who had slept with one eye open, who had never asked for anything, was now staring at him like she was afraid of the answer she already knew. "You're a fool," she whispered. "I've been called worse." They sat there, bleeding, breathing, and burning in the aftermath of survival. And in that narrow shaft of light between them, something passed. Not words, not promises, but understanding. Saryth looked down at her shaking hands, and didn't let go of the blade. But for the first time, She wished she could. The air in the maintenance shaft had gone still again. Not quiet like before, but saturated, heavy with smoke, adrenaline, and something unspoken. Kael and Saryth sat on opposite sides of the narrow corridor, their backs pressed to cold steel, just breathing. Outside, the Black Corps squad regrouped. They moved through the station like a slow tide, methodical and confident. They believed in inevitability. They always had. But for the first time in her life, Saryth didn't. Kael looked over at her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Not where it shows." He watched her fingers. They trembled slightly, still clenched around her blade. She hadn't sheathed it since the fight. Not because of him, but because of them. Her former masters. The ones who thought they still owned her. "They'll send more," she said. "I know. They'll keep coming. I know that, too." She turned to face him, eyes glowing faintly in the low light. "Then why did you stay?" Kael hesitated, then answered plainly. "Because someone finally looked at me and didn't see someone broken, and I want to be that person for you." The silence between them deepened, not as a void, but as something full, charged. Saryth's throat moved, but no sound came. She wasn't used to people saying things like that. She was used to commands, not kindness. Expectations, not choices. "I wasn't made to be kept," she said softly. Kael smiled. "Good, I'm not trying to keep you." She blinked. "I just want you to know," he continued. "If you run again, I'll understand. But you don't have to run alone." The words hit harder than plasma. Saryth stood slowly. Her posture was rigid, unsure, like her own body didn't know how to respond to the ache in her chest. She stepped closer, kneeling in front of him. Their faces were close now. Close enough for Kael to see the faint, swirling markings on her skin, more scars than tattoos. Stories no one had asked to hear. Until now. "Do you know what it means when someone like me stays?" she asked. Kael's voice was barely a whisper. "I think I'd like to find out." She reached out slowly, cautiously, touched his hand. Her fingers were cold, but the contact burned. They stayed like that, fingers barely linked, breath mingling in the narrow space between fear and something softer. Something she had no word for. Something he was willing to wait a lifetime to name. Then she spoke. 3 words, small, shaky, but hers. "I'll stay tonight." Kael nodded. "Then tonight is enough." The station was no longer silent. It howled. Warning sirens, failing systems, sparks dancing across shattered conduits. Every hallway lit by emergency red and the firelight of a dying reactor core. Kael sprinted down the corridor, his breath sharp, lungs burning. Behind him, the sound of boots. Heavy, organized, coming fast. Saryth was already ahead. She moved like a ghost through fire, her armor scorched, her blade drawn, no more hesitation, no more conflict in her steps. This time, she wasn't protecting a mission. She was protecting him, and he was keeping up, barely. The second wave from Black Corps had arrived. Heavier, better armed, smarter. They didn't just want Saryth now, they wanted everything she had touched. The data logs, the station's encrypted core. "Kael." "Cut left," she shouted over her shoulder. Kael ducked into a service hatch just as a plasma round slammed into the wall where his head had been a second earlier. They landed inside a control room, small, sealed. Saryth turned and welded the door shut in seconds. The panel sparked. She didn't flinch. Kael leaned on a console, panting. "They're not here to capture anymore." "No," she said. "They're here to erase." She crossed the room to him, touched the edge of his sleeve. Burned, bloodied. She didn't ask if he was okay, he didn't need her to. "We can't hold this place." he said. Not without help. Saryth shook her head. There is no help, but there is us. She knelt at the floor panel, pried it open with her knife, and revealed the last ace Kael had forgotten they had. A sub-reactor control module. You're going to blow the core, he said. Not the core, just enough of the tether grid to collapse their signal relay. Blind them. You'll trap us here. Saryth looked up, eyes burning bright. Only if you stay. Kael stared at her. She was giving him an out, the only one. I can hold the hall, she said. You take the escape pod, get off this rock, go somewhere the core can't find you. No, her expression didn't change. You'll die. So will you. He stepped toward her. I won't let that happen. She exhaled. Kael, no, he said again. You don't get to protect me from this. Not alone. I started running when I lost everything, but with you, I stopped. Saryth didn't move. He stepped even closer. If we fall, Kael said, we fall together. A long pause, then she smiled, small, shattered, beautiful. Then, let's give them something to remember. They moved fast, planted charges, hacked the door systems, funneled the squad into a trap of flickering lights and broken gravity fields. Kael rerouted the power. Saryth took the high ground. The fight was short, brutal, glorious. When the last core soldier hit the floor, Saryth dropped her blade, blood on her cheek, her arm shaking. Kael caught her as she collapsed into him. I told you, she whispered, we weren't done yet. He held her tight as alarms screamed around them, and neither of them let go. The silence after the fire was the hardest to bear. The station, once alive with alarms and warfare, now lay still beneath a shell of smoke and fractured metal. The walls were scorched. The air carried the smell of ozone, burnt steel, and something heavier, like memory turned to ash. Kael sat beside Saryth in what remained of the control deck. Her armor was cracked down one side. His shoulder was wrapped in makeshift gauze, stained deep red. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Outside the viewport, space stretched vast and black. The stars didn't celebrate their survival. They just shimmered. Cold, indifferent, eternal. But in that small room of ruin and flickering lights, something else lived. Stillness and choice. Saryth leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half-lidded, breath even. They won't come again, she said quietly. Not after what we did. Kael stared at her for a long time. Because they think we're dead? She nodded. Or worse, uncontrollable. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Good, let them wonder. Silence again. Then he asked, what happens now? Saryth looked at him. Really looked. And for once her eyes didn't burn with fire. They shimmered with something gentler, something uncertain. I don't know, she admitted. I've never lived past the mission. Kael reached over, took her hand, held it, not like a promise, but like a beginning. Then let's figure it out, he said, together. She turned her palm in his, closed her fingers around his. I was trained to walk away, she whispered, from places, from people, from anything that made me feel. He nodded. I know. I don't want to walk anymore. Kael leaned in, rested his forehead against hers. Then stay. Outside, the debris field of the last Black Core cruiser drifted past the window. Silent. Defeated. A reminder that empires could fall to things they never understood, like connection, like trust, like love born in the middle of a war neither of them asked for. Kael stood slowly, offering her his hand. Come on, he said. The station's a mess. We've got a lot to rebuild. She took his hand and didn't let go. They walked out of the control room, side by side, into the remains of the station. Not as enemies, not as fugitives, but as two people who had nothing left to fear, because they had already chosen each other, and for now, that was everything. What if your ending wasn't the one they wrote for you? Would you stay broken, or would you choose something better, even if all you had was a hand to hold and a place to begin again? Leave a comment. Because sometimes the bravest story is not the one where you fight, but the one where you finally stay.